600 years old and still in good form. Now on BBC Learning Zone, the OU brings the sonnet into the 21st century.
Scorn not the sonnet, critic. You have frowned, mindless of its just honours. With this key, Shakespeare unlocked his heart. The melody of this small lute gave ease to Petrarch's wound. 1,000 times this pipe did Tasso sound. With it, Camoens soothed an exile's grief. The sonnet glittered a gay myrtle leaf amid the cypress with which Dante crowned his visionary brow. A glowworm lamp, it cheered Miles Spencer, called from fairyland, to struggle through dark ways. And when a damp fell round the path of Milton, in his hand the thing became a trumpet, whence he blew soul-animating strains. Alas, too few.
Wordsworth's poem is a celebration of the sonnet, one of the oldest and best-known forms of poetry. It's been used by poets since the 13th century. The tight structure of the sonnet, usually 14 lines, divided into 8 and 6 with a strong rhyming scheme, is still used today. The sonnet has retained its appeal among contemporary poets. Tony Harrison's work is widely known. For him, the long tradition of the sonnet has a strong and positive attraction.
One of the advantages of using a form like the sonnet, for example, a formal poem, is first you get a kind of, it's not like Alcoholics Anonymous or Sonneteers Anonymous, but it's like, in some ways it's like that, because you're sitting down with a lot of poets from the past who you would like to think of as your friends and allies, Wordsworth and Milton and Hopkins and all the people who've made sonnets. And this is a kind of very enabling current that passes around this kind of gathering. And I like it for that. So it gives me a kind of confidence to overcome this kind of sense of futility that you often feel about how effective, valid, civilizing poetry can be. And the other thing is that strong, powerful emotions are very hard to articulate and measure without some kind of form. And I think that form, for me, has never been something which inhibits feeling. It's always been something which allows me to examine and explore and even develop and understand feeling. I've never thought of it as a constriction, a corset.
Tony Harrison was brought up in the city of Leeds, which is the setting for many of his poems. His working-class upbringing and his close connection with the city and its people have inspired some of his best-known sonnets. His childhood experience inspires the content of the poems, but also influences the choice of form.
There's another influence which for me is important, which enters the structure. It's something which happens in my theatre work, is that I go for inspiration to my earliest experience of theatre, which was music hall, variety, and the model of the stand-up comic, for example. And I take the model of the stand-up comic, it so happens that the structure of the sonnet is very like the structure of a joke. So, and if you can take the structure of a joke, but use it sometimes for dark and sometimes bitter or political purposes, I think you get a clue into the way some of my sonnets are structured.
Tony Harrison's experiences at school have been the subject of one of these rather dark but comic poems, one with a hard political edge. Them and Us is a sequence of 2 sonnets which takes the form of a dialogue between teacher and pupil and explores the way regional speech was denigrated by the education system.
Aye, 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 stutterer Demosthenes, gob full of pebbles, out-shouting seas. 4 words only of, "Me heart aches, mine's broken, you barbarian, T.W." He was nicely spoken. Can't have our glorious heritage done to death. I played the drunken porter in Macbeth. Poetry's the speech of kings. You're one of those. Shakespeare gives the comic bits to prose. All poetry, even Cockney Keats, you see, has been dubbed by us into RP. Received pronunciation. Please believe us. Your speech is in the hands of the receivers. We say us, not us, T.W. That shut my trap. I doffed my flat A's, as in flat cap, my mouth all stuffed with glottals, great lumps to hawk up and spit out. Enunciate! So, right, you buggers, then. We'll occupy your lousy leasehold poetry. I chewed up literature and spat the bones into the lap of dozing Daniel Jones, dropped the initials I'd been harried as, and used my name and own voice. Us, 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 ended sentences with by, with, from, and spoke the language that I spoke at home. R.I.P., R.P., R.I.P., T.W. I'm Tony Harrison, no longer you. You can tell the receivers where to go and not aspirate it. Once you know Wordsworth's matter, watter are full rhymes. Us can be loving as well as funny. My first mention in the Times automatically made Tony Anthony.
In the 16th century, the sonnet was associated with an aristocratic voice and an idealised subject matter, markedly different from the colloquial style and immediacy of Harrison's work. Sir Philip Sidney was one of the earliest English sonneteers. He was brought up in one of the great country houses, Penshurst in Kent. The house embodies the aristocratic values and courtly ideals of his intricate and often complex poetry.
My true love hath my heart, and I have his, by just exchange one for the other given. I hold his dear, and mine he cannot miss. There never was a better bargain driven. His heart in me keeps me and him in one. My heart in him his thoughts and senses guides. He loves my heart, for once it was his own. I cherish his, because in me it bides. His heart his wound received from my sight. My heart was wounded with his wounded heart. For as from me on him his hurt did light, so still methought in me his hurt did smart. Both equal hurt in this change sought one bliss. My true love hath my heart, and I have his.
The Sidney sonnet, My true love hath my heart and I have his, which is sometimes called The Bargain, although I don't think that's Sidney's title, is a poem I enjoyed, especially the opening lines. I enjoy. I mean, found it as a young woman. I found it an enjoyably romantic poem. I think that may have been a misreading, because I now think that Sidney perhaps has some ironic distance on this woman and her feelings. And but I found, on looking at it more closely, and that it's actually quite hard to follow. That you get confused about which heart is which, in a way that almost becomes funny. And I wrote a poem in the voice of my invented male poet, Jason Strugnell. I wrote a poem called Strugnell's Bargain, which is Strugnell on the same subject, sort of making play with this idea that when you've got my heart and her heart and they've swapped, so it just gets a bit hard to follow. My true love hath my heart, and I have hers. We swapped last Tuesday and felt quite elated. But now, whenever one of us refers to my heart, things get rather complicated. Just now, when she complained, my heart is racing. You mean my heart is racing, I replied. That's what I said. You mean the heart replacing your heart, my love. Oh, piss off, Jake, she cried. I ask you, do you think Sir Philip Sidney got spoken to like that? And I suspect if I threw in my liver and a kidney, she'd still address me with as scant respect. Therefore do I revoke my opening line. My love can keep her heart, and I'll have mine.
Strugnell's Bargain is a reworking of a poem on the traditional theme of love, but with a more evident comic tone. The structure of Wendy Cope's sonnet, however, is conventional. She uses the form as Shakespeare did. This time, there are 3 sets of 4 lines or quatrains, intricately rhymed, and there's a closing couplet which resolves or summarises the events or concerns of the sonnet.
Reading Shakespeare's sonnets, it's the way it builds towards that. I mean, I really enjoy the way it builds towards that final couplet, and that's where you really get the emotional hit from the final couplet. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ nor no man ever loved. But you need the 12 lines going towards that. I think my favourite is When in Disgrace with Fortune and Men's Eyes, because when you think this is Shakespeare desiring this man's art and that man's scope, I mean, this is Shakespeare feeling kind of really bad and having no confidence, and it's I find it's a completely amazing poem, and I find the end of it very moving.
When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble death heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings.
Sonnets have often been linked with particular works of art, especially portraits. The 19th century poet and painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti wrote sonnets to accompany his depictions of idealized women, sometimes on the painting itself. In her poem The Sitter, Wendy Cope,
called Writing on the Wall, which is a collection of writings by women writers responding to works of art by women in the Tate Gallery. And so I went to Tate Gallery and met up with one of the curators, who took me on a little tour pointing out certain paintings and sculptures by women. And I went away and thought about it. And the picture that stayed with me, and that I felt I had something to say about this picture, was a picture I didn't like very much, unhappy in the picture, and you felt she might not be looking her best. And I think the poem owes quite a lot to my experiences of having my picture painted or having my photograph taken. And I imagined what this sitter might want to say to Vanessa Bell if she could speak. Depressed and beneath her gaze, I couldn't help but slouch. She made me feel ashamed. My face went red. Friends, the way they saw this face of mine, and her contempt for me is what lives on. Admired, well-bred, artistic Mrs. Bell, I hope you're looking hideous in hell.
Rossetti referred to the sonnet as a moment's monument. The structure of the sonnet gave weight and substance to even the briefest impression, and could memorialise a seemingly ephemeral event. One of the most prolific sonneteers of the 19th century was Charles Tennyson Turner. His poem Letty's Globe well illustrates why Rossetti called the sonnet a moment's monument.
When Letty had scarce passed her third glad year, and her young artless words began to flow, one day we gave the child a coloured sphere of the wide earth, that she might mark and know by tint and outline all its sea and land. She patted all the world. Old empires peeped between her baby fingers. Her soft hand was welcome at all frontiers. How she leaped and laughed and prattled in her worldwide bliss. But when we turned her sweet, unlearned eye on our own isle, she raised a joyous cry. "Oh, yes, I see it! Letty's home is there!" And while she hid all England with a kiss, bright over Europe fell her golden hair.
In Letty's Globe, Charles Tennyson Turner identifies and writes about a single moment, a very short, brief event where the child, the three-year-old girl Letty, is given a globe of the world and recognises England, which is the size of a kiss, and then her hair falls over Europe. That's all that happens in the poem. So it really is a very, very short event. The poet has noticed this, dramatised it, used the structure of the sonnet to communicate it with tremendous effect and with wonderful domestic lyric beauty to the reader.
Like most conventional sonnets, Letty's Globe has a strong rhyming scheme. It also has an unusual division. Instead of the usual 8 lines and 6 lines, it's divided into a pattern of 5, 4, and 5. The distribution of rhyme and arrangement of lines creates what might be thought of as melody.
By melodic structure, I mean the organisation of the poem, not only in terms of how thought is organised, but how a rhyme scheme, how rhyme and rhythm convey the thought and the feeling, back them up, support them, and communicate them to the reader. And I think we can hear melody in this bit of direct speech where Letty speaks. "Oh, yes, I see it, Letty's home is there. And while she hid all England with a kiss, bright over Europe fell her golden hair." The emphasis on the rhymes is natural but tending to the languid. It's almost inviting you to get as much noise out of this poem as you can. It wants to be audible, and sonnets are like that. They want to be audible, they want to be heard. They're melodic structures, musical structures.
This musical structure is clearly evident in Douglas Dunn's own sonnets in Elegies, a book dedicated to his first wife, Leslie, who died in 1981. Like Letty's Globe, his poem Sandra's Mobile uses all the resources of the sonnet, rhyme, rhythm, to compress its strong emotions into just 14 lines.
A constant artist, dedicated to curves
shapes, the pleasant shades, the feel of colour. She did not care what shapes, what red, what blue, scorning the dull to ridicule the duller with a disinterested, loyal eye. So Sandra brought her this and taped it up. 3 seagulls from a white and indoor sky, a gift of old artistic comradeship. Blow on them, love. Those silent birds winged round on thermals of my breath. On her last night, trying to stay awake, I saw love crowned in tears and wooden birds and candlelight. She did not wake again. To prove our love, each gull, each gull, each gull turned into dove.
Grief and loss are also the subject of some of Tony Harrison's best-known work, especially the painful sense of distance he came to feel between his working-class childhood and his adult life as an educated poet.
When my parents died, I had to consider what I'd acquired, the eloquence that I sought to struggle with and become able in. What was I using it for when much of the poetry I'd written was not accessible to people like my parents? And the shock, if you like, of their death made me reconsider that and write poems which, alas, a kind of bitter irony, they were no longer around to receive, but which were written in many ways for them to read, as well as for them in the sense of celebrating their life or my love of them or my loss.
Tony Harrison's father was a baker. In his poem Marked with D, images drawn from bread making provide the basis for an elegy on his father's death.
When the chilled dough of his flesh went in an oven not unlike those he'd fueled all his life, I thought of his cataracts ablaze with heaven and radiant with the sight of his dead wife, light streaming from his mouth to shape her name, not Florence and not Flo, but always Florrie. I thought how his cold tongue burst into flame, but only literally, which makes me sorry. Sorry for his sake, there's no heaven to reach. I get it all from earth, my daily bread. But he hungered for release from mortal speech that kept him down, the tongue that weighed like lead. The baker's man that no one will see rise, an England made to feel like some dull oath, is smoke, enough to sting one person's eyes, and ash, not unlike flour, for one small loaf.
In Marked with D, Tony Harrison employs the more unusual but more flexible 16-line sonnet. The tight structure of 12 lines followed by 4 turns the sonnet from grief to anger.
I think that Marked with D, which does pass from a very private feeling of grief about my father to an anger about his feeling of linguistic inadequacy, his lack of power, his lack of power over language made him lack power generally. And it's interesting that there is a turn, if you like. The turn in a Shakespearean sonnet would be the last couplet, and that would be two That would be too little. It had to be a quatrain. And I think that's a good example of the advantages of the 16-line sonnet, and that the turn enabled me to make a weightier turn.
One of the reasons poets through the centuries have been attracted to the sonnet form is that the powerfully compressed structure of the sonnet helps poets, then and now, to identify and preserve the most deeply felt moments.
It's about concentration. It's about paring away what is unnecessary. It's about, but it's also momentary. I always think that for me, it's also a sad form. It allows people to write sad sonnets of love because it celebrates the love moment, and it celebrates things, emotions often which cannot bear holding for much longer. That the intensity can only be short-lived.
This closing poem, Bookends, exemplifies the kind of intensity the sonnet can achieve, in this case by focusing its grief and loss on a simple everyday image of bookends. The sonnet gives a powerful focus to the feelings of division and distance between father and son on a day when they should have been close, the day Harrison's mother died.
Baked the day she suddenly dropped dead, we chew it slowly, that last apple pie. Shocked into sleeplessness, you're scared of bed. We never could talk much, and now don't try. You're like bookends, the pair of you, she'd say. Hog that great, say nothing, sit, sleep, stare. The scholar, me, you, worn out on poor pay. Only our silence made us seem a pair. Not as good for staring in blue gas. Too regular, each bud, each yellow spike. A night you need my company to pass, and she not here to tell us we're alike. Your life's all shattered into smithereens. Back in our silences and sullen looks, for all the scotch we drinks, what's still betweens, not the 30 or so years, but books, books, books.
Alert us at BBC I for your free weekly email listing all BBC TV and radio programmes on your chosen subject at bbc.co.uk/alert.
His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscle and arteries beneath. His watery eyes seemed almost of the same colour as the dun white sockets in which they were set. His shrivelled complexion and straight black lips.
I didn't start out to do a degree. I started out to see if I could study, to do a course for a year and see how it went, and you could build it up. And after a couple of years I had a diploma, and I was delighted with that, a computing diploma. And at that point I knew that I was going to go all the way.
Sexagenarian Dreams on BBC Learning Zone now. Music to the ear.
The Beatles song When I'm 64 was recorded in 1967 for the Sgt. Pepper album. Whether you remember the original or not, hearing the song evokes images of the 60s. Whatever music you're listening to, you probably hear it first as a whole piece. With a song, you might then hear the melody, singing along with the words. Or perhaps notice little flourishes from the different instruments that add colour to the piece. Or you might tap out the rhythm. Music can be broken down into these different parts or elements, the ingredients with which composers work. Some pieces of music focus on one particular element: rhythm, melody, or timbre. When elements are combined, highlighting them one by one can help us to hear the whole piece differently. So what's the mix of ingredients in When I'm 64? In all music, time is structured in some way. Rhythm is the foundation of music, the heartbeat. When I'm 64 has a regular pattern which underpins the whole song. A clear beat, played by the bass guitar. The other rhythm instrument here is the drum kit. The drummer emphasises the same beat as the bass guitar, but also adds interesting rhythmic detail. This is the main pattern played by the drums, but it isn't always the same throughout the song. There are places where the drummer has different patterns, or where he uses different parts of the kit, such as the hi-hat. If we put these different patterns together, in verse 1 of the song, the drummer plays this. Rhythm was the focus of much of American composer Steve Reich's work in the early 1970s.
My music in the 1960s and 1970s was American music. You could even say more specifically music mostly from New York City. Extremely rhythmic, somewhat abrasive. Pieces with more attention given to rhythm than to changes of harmony or to changes of orchestration. Clapping music was composed in 1972, but the reason that I did the piece was really traceable to a visit to a flamenco club in Brussels. Now, as you know, Brussels is not famous for flamenco. What we were doing in Brussels was giving a concert. My ensemble was giving a concert. And in those days, this was in the early 70s, we were not very well known, and we had a vast amount of equipment. We carried our own marimbas, our own glockenspiels, our own drums, our own electric organs, our own amplifiers, our own microphones, and these were in big black packing cases which had to be put inside of 2 small trucks and driven around Europe by myself and one of the other musicians. So after this concert in Brussels, which used all this equipment, the sponsor took us out to this nightclub, and there were these two musicians playing guitar and singing, and they weren't very good, as you might imagine in Brussels. But they started to clap, as flamenco musicians do, and their clapping was absolutely chillingly good. And so after a few drinks, myself and the other members of the group, some of whom were percussionists, began sort of fooling around with clapping patterns, and the idea sort of occurred to me, what if the truck didn't make it? What if the lights went out? What if the fuse blew? Here's a piece that you can do anytime, any place, without 2,000 pounds of equipment. All you need is 2 human beings. Clapping music is constructed out of basically one repeating pattern, which is, I play that throughout the whole piece, and Thad starts in unison with me playing the exact same pattern, and then he shifts it one beat ahead. So for instance, at bar 2, he ends up playing. So if you put that together, what we'll do, just to show you how that works, is we'll play bar 1 in unison, 4 repeats, and then we'll switch to the second bar. Thad will make a little nod at the downbeat of the second bar so you can see and hear the change, and we'll do 4 repeats of that. Piece continues with Thad moving ahead, a bar ahead of me each time, and each time he changes, as you hear in the full complete piece, the pattern, the overall pattern between us changes. When he gets almost back together with me, we'll play it again just at 1 bar before he comes back into unison. So we took the beginning and 1 ahead, and now we've gone all the way around, and we're just before the ending. We'll do 4 repeats of that, he'll nod, and then we'll go back into unison.
Melody is generally the most striking aspect of a song. A catchy tune is one of the hallmarks of many Beatles songs. And it's not only Paul McCartney who has the melody. By the time we get to verse 3, there's also a version of the tune for clarinet. Melody, like rhythm, is an important part of the song. It's also the driving force behind a lot of folk music, and not just songs. Memorable tunes mean traditional music survives.
Most traditional musicians have a big bank of tunes which they can draw on. They're not catalogued or anything like that in your head, but they pop out when needed. I learned most of my music from my grandparents initially, and from other relatives and friends playing around. I just received the tunes from them as if it were learning to speak or learning a language. The tunes just went in, and I have them there to draw on them when I feel like it. That was the first part of a traditional Irish polka. It's very simple in form in that the melody is restricted to a very small range of notes. And you may have noticed that the melody moves very much in step. There are no major leaps or jumps within the tune. This is a scheme used very much in Irish music, where the melody is very simple to lure the listener to listen to the tune. The pub, as a cultural venue, let's say, is relatively new. When I say relatively new, perhaps 100 years, and what was there were regarded as visiting houses, or where the people actually had parties or gatherings in their houses, and the musicians would gather in those houses and perform there. This has progressed to the pub, and generally the music today is played in sessions and very often in the pub setup. In a session, that polka would be taken as a unit, but then you could progress to another tune and maybe another tune, and it could even go to another tune. So it becomes kind of a circle of tunes. could expect people from any walk of life to arrive into the session, really, from doctors to fishermen to farmers, could be anybody. Generally, there'd be the makeup of fiddles, flutes, perhaps tin whistles, accordions, which we call the box, and then going into the accompaniment instruments, which would be guitar or bouzouki, and perhaps a percussion instrument, the bodhrán.
In an Irish music session, the actual sound of the music is flexible, depending on who turns up to play. Each instrument produces its own tone colour, or timbre. In When I'm 64, we've heard the fundamental rhythm instruments, the bass guitar and the drums. And we've seen how the voice of Paul McCartney is matched by the clarinet in the third verse. The clarinet is also there to provide a particular timbre. In fact, there's a trio of clarinets, 2 clarinets and a bass clarinet. It's their special tone colours that contribute to the almost cabaret effect of the song. The clarinet part is constructed on 3 levels. The first clarinet on the top line, with the most interesting part. The bass clarinet is a kind of highlight instrument at specific points. And the second clarinet fills the gap between the two. Clarinets also play in the chorus, little flourishes which lead the way back to the verse. For Japanese composer Toru Takemitsu, timbre has always been important, with the colours of different instruments exploited for their own sake. A technique inherited from certain composers working earlier in the 20th century.
僕の音楽の生活が始まったのが戦争直後ですから。僕の最初の頃は、まあ今でもそうだけれども、ドビュッシー、アバンベルグ、ウェーベル、メッシアンの音楽には非常に影響を受けて、まあ、それどうしてかっていうと、多分それは色彩、音楽の色彩、カラーというものだと思うんですね。というのは、まあ僕は日本人で音楽を聴くときにいつもその音の音色っていうか、その音の色っていうものに非常に、強い関心があって、そういうヨーロッパの新しい作曲家と同じような仕事をしたいというふうにまあ思ったわけで、何も抵抗はなかった。
Timbre is foregrounded in his music more than rhythm or melody. He even colours his manuscripts as part of the composing process. Another important stimulus for him is nature, the seasons, landscapes, and above all, water.
日本人にとって水ってのは非常に大事で、世界中誰でもそうですけど、僕自身はその水っていうものは非常に強く惹かれるっていうか感動したのは、僕の家のそばにそのアーティフィシャルレイクがあって、それが一回人造湖が水がなくなって干してなんか発掘してたことがあるんですね。その時にその人造湖の中に一本川が走ってて、普段水がいっぱい張ってある時はその川が見えなかったわけだけど、その水がなくなった時にその水の中にまたもう一つ川が流れてるってことにそれがなんて言うんでしょうね、僕は音楽を書くとき非常になんか強い霊感を与えてくれるわけです。
Takamitsu's love of water led him to compose a whole series of waterscapes. One of these, Rain Tree, depicts a very special tree whose thousands of finger-like leaves store moisture, sprinkling the previous night's drops of rain onto the ground in the following afternoon.
タイトルを思いついたらほとんど僕の場合は3分の2は作曲が終わってるっていうか、タイトルはなんか非常に聞く人を限定しては束縛してはいけないし、だけれどもその人に何か喚起するものをサジェストして方向をづける。
Here the title Rain Tree stimulated the composer to use the tone colours of percussion instruments, marimbas and vibraphone, to represent the sound of water droplets, scattered raindrop, or rain droplet from the leaves. He enhances the colour of the piece even further by giving lighting instructions for performance. Each instrument can be highlighted by a spotlight, turned on or off at particular moments in the piece. Takamitsu uses percussion for a specific sound effect. Similarly, percussion is used in When I'm 64 in the chorus. With a slight change in the second chorus. There's also a piano playing, providing a more subtle timbre to the piece. You hear it fleetingly in verse 1, and in verse 3, and more clearly in the chorus. At the end of the second chorus, both piano and bells add colour, but the bells also pick out some of the melody. If we add the kit, or rhythm, we begin to hear some of the ingredients working together in this song. Knowing some of what's gone into the song helps us hear the whole thing differently. The spotlight is no longer on any single element.
Education, it's one of the country's top priorities. But have you ever thought of teaching as a career? You can influence and inspire. You can provide lasting guidance for young minds. Whether you're thinking of joining the profession or if you're already teaching, Working in Education is the series for you. It's designed to help you with your work, your studies and your career. Working in Education is on BBC Two's Learning Zone on weekdays from 5 to 6 a.m. until the 1st of March.
Alert us at BBC I for your free weekly email listing all BBC TV and radio programmes on your chosen subject at bbc.co.uk/alert.
Thinking that the study of art was just about studying pictures, but I'm learning that it's the study also of certain societies. There are certain things that I can take from art and I can use within the police service. It's something I love. It's something I want to do. Therefore, I will get to the end.
Into the final round on BBC Learning Zone now, the OU referees a debate on the pros and cons of boxing. Amongst the contenders are Barry McGowan and Lord Hattersley.
Henry is dripping blood, and I think Tommy Little will have to stop this because Cooper's eye is really in an absolutely appalling state. It is the worst cut eye I've seen for a very, very long time indeed. I do not see how he can let this go further.
Finnegan has opened up on him, and Minter's in real trouble. Finnegan sees his chance. They maul each other to the floor. Minter's gum shield is on the floor and has been for 30 seconds. McGuigan's work has not been so effective in this round. He hasn't found the range. Yes, he did. He's got it with the right. Oh, the champion's over.
Boxing exists today because society accepts it as a top-class sport, and that's reflected by the millions of people who turn on to watch it. There are huge amounts of fans out there, and we can't have a small minority of people trying to enforce their opinion on the majority. You know, it's about freedom of choice. It's about being able to choose what you want to do, and if that entails danger, well, then so be it.
I believe that if you're going to have a truly free society, you're going to have a society that respects individuals, respects individual rights and respects individual personas. And I think it's very difficult to have a society which respects individual personas, individual liberties, individual rights, if it's also a society that enjoys seeing young men beat each other to insensitivity.
Should we ban boxing? That's not obviously a philosophical question, but you can't really give a satisfactory answer to it without using philosophy. If you study philosophy, you have to learn to think critically. You have to be able to analyse the structure of an argument, pick out its strengths and weaknesses, and so on. But you also have to be able to recognise the philosophical question.
I don't think it's reasonable to go into philosophy hoping you're going to find a set of definite answers. But I think it is reasonable to expect you'll find ways of confronting the difficulties and beginning to think about them and beginning to hold something of the complexity of the difficulties in your head.
I think it's awfully difficult to give any one clear answer to the question what philosophy is, because one of the glories of the subject, if I can put it like that, is that people come at it from very different angles. But I don't think I count anybody as a philosopher or even interested in philosophy if they weren't interested in certain very general things. I mean, if you think of a historian, he may be trying to get at the truth about a particular period of history without necessarily bothering about whether other periods of history were like this or there are any trends or anything else. But a philosopher, I think, essentially is not interested just in how things are now, so he may start from there, but whether, thinking about how things are now, there are any very general things that apply or must apply to the universe at large.
The issue of whether boxing should be banned is a complicated one. The point of this programme isn't to come to any definite conclusions, but looking at the debate allows us to do two things. First, and most importantly, it allows us to bring out the abstract philosophical questions underlying this social issue. But secondly, it allows us to analyse the structure of arguments.
Well, the British Medical Association has been very concerned about boxing for a number of years. We've done a couple of reports. There's two aspects, though, on the brain that we're concerned about. One that everybody knows about, and that is the acute damage to the brain. Not surprising. I mean, we're talking about closed head injury here. That's effectively what blows to the head are. And when that's very dramatic, it can cause a into the brain substance. And that may cause, actually, depression of vital functions and death. The other element that is not so widely recognised, and indeed the boxing fraternity to date have denied that it exists at all, is the cumulative small damage, which appears to be irreversible, which is the result of repeated damage to the brain.
I don't think boxing should be banned, and that's to the people like myself that are involved in boxing, that's an insulting question, because should rugby be banned? Should motorsport be banned? Should horse riding and equestrian competition, should that be banned? All of these sports are much more dangerous, statistically have a much higher fatality and serious injury rate than boxing. So it's unfair to say that boxing, I even asked the question, should boxing be banned?
I think the value of studying philosophy is essentially this, that it is a training in what you can fairly call critical thinking. It does make people bear down on whether or not what they say is clear, consistent, complete, and in every other way conceptually adequate. That is a valuable attribute if you can get onto it.
Critical thinking is an essential tool in philosophy. It's easy with an emotive subject like boxing to get drawn into the argument on the basis of your feelings. But as philosophers, we need to step back a bit and analyse the structure of arguments. Fleur Fisher's first point was that boxing is dangerous. This is her basic premise. She's speaking on behalf of the British Medical Association, who've called for a ban on all boxing, so we can safely assume her implicit conclusion is, therefore boxing should be banned. Barry McGuigan points out that boxing is no more dangerous than many other sports. So, if Fleur Fisher's implicit premise is all dangerous sports should be banned, then consistency requires her to call for a ban on these other sports too, or else to spell out what's so special about boxing.
Well, something special about it is that part of the point of boxing is success is acute brain damage, isn't it? Knocking your opponent out. And of course, in boxing, the brain is subject to far more damage than in any other sport. You may have a clash of heads in rugby. You may, and indeed you will have damage. I'm sure we haven't looked at that, and I don't think anybody else has scientifically. You will have damage, potentially, from heading the ball in football. You may well have damage if you fall off your head on a horse. But the single thing about boxing is that that is the intention of the sport. And in every bout of boxing, the brain gets rattled about within the bony, corrugated inside of the skull and causes damage.
Of course there's deliberate intent in boxing, but we're trained to handle the other opponent trying to punch you. We have spent years developing our defensive skills, building up our neck muscles, building up our bodies, honing ourselves into fabulous condition. It's been proven out there in numerous tests that there is no other sport that has the same level of cardiovascular fitness and muscle endurance that boxing has. So bear in mind that we're in tremendous shape and we have dedicated ourselves to the sport and we've trained our muscles and our reactions and our speed and our reflexes to be able to handle punishment.
There are risks in many sports, and I believe that it's incumbent on the governing bodies of sport to make sure that we do a risk analysis, that we judge scientifically the risks that are inherent in the sport and how we can minimise that. People say, if you saw there was damage in rugby, would you therefore ban rugby? No, I think the issue is here that we're looking at minimising the dangers. For instance, the risk of fracturing the neck in a scrum and so on. The rules have to be looked at to prevent that. They have to be strictly monitored and implemented, and teachers have to make sure that they train youngsters in the right sort of way. Now, if we look at boxing, the only way that damage to the brain, repeated closed head injury, could be prevented in boxing is by taking the head out of the target area. And if people say, well, then boxing wouldn't be boxing, when the only thing you can do is give up boxing.
I would put it to the BMA right now. We would be prepared, we as the Professional Boxers Association, I'm the president and I know my colleagues feel the same way, we've had several meetings about this. We will put the British Medical Association on the line here and say to them that if Rugby League and Rugby Union were prepared to take part, and any of the other contact sports were prepared to take part in a series of tests over a number of years where they would be compared, and it would have to be a comparable situation. And I will guarantee it right now, a similar test has been done in Sweden, and there was no difference. In fact, boxers suffered less damage.
Fleur Fisher's response to the challenge of inconsistency is that boxing is different from other sports. She picks out features which she thinks justify giving it special treatment. In other sports, risks can be identified and minimised, but boxing is different on two counts. First, there's no way of minimising risk without taking the head out of the target area. And secondly, the risk of brain damage is very much greater in boxing. Fleur Fisher goes so far as to describe the whole point of the sport as causing injury to the brain. Barry McGuigan counters this in two ways. First, he says, boxers train harder and are therefore better able to cope with possible injuries. And secondly, there's no conclusive evidence to support the contention that boxing is more dangerous than other sports. And there's even some evidence to suggest that it's less dangerous. The issue at stake here is what we call empirical evidence, hard facts, if you like. Both parties differ in their interpretation of the available facts, and what's probably needed is more scientific research into the comparative dangers of boxing. Without that, we can't really move much further with this line of argument. So far, we've just considered the medical arguments, but a different approach is to think about the positive aspects of boxing and the social consequences of banning it.
Thousands and thousands of adolescent boys benefit from boxing in many different ways. They have benefited in character building, they have had success, and to young boys, success in sport is very important to them. Many of these kids come from deprived backgrounds, poor backgrounds, both parents out of work, no money, no employment, no hope, and this is the only opportunity for them to do something and to make something out of their life. They're surrounded with aggression and belligerence, and it's a way of channeling their aggressions and making a career for themselves. And apart from the aggressive side of things, it's a great sport. It teaches kids discipline and, as I say, self-respect, and they only get out of something what they put into it. Determination, respect for elders. We do, of course, realise the risks, but it's worth the risks. It's worth the risk for the many people who achieve levels of success and wealth and fame that they never dreamt possible.
I think it's the most disgraceful statement, comment on our society that I can imagine. We have already said that these are able, focused, competent, disciplined, organised youngsters. What kind of society have we got if the only thing that we can offer to this group of young men who very overwhelmingly come from backgrounds of often ethnic minorities, but often socially disadvantaged backgrounds, what does it say about us as a nation if all we can offer them is a career which at the end offers the possibility of acute brain damage and death, and the certainty of cumulative brain destruction?
At the end of the day, if they force boxing underground, if they push it underground, the BMA and the anti-boxing brigade will not be able to accept. They will. I will ask this question: will they be prepared to accept the amount of fatalities that will increase, the amount of serious injuries? And don't for 1 minute think that it won't happen, because right now, at this moment in time, boxing, unlicensed boxing, is thriving.
This argument is about consequences. Both Barry McGuigan and Fleur Fisher would probably agree on the consequences of banning boxing. Where they differ is on the significance they attach to those consequences. Barry McGuigan concedes that there is a risk of injury, but this is far outweighed by two negative consequences. First, young men would be deprived of an important way of countering social disadvantage. And secondly, a more dangerous illegal form of unlicensed boxing would almost certainly emerge. Fleur Fisher maintains that the risk of brain damage is so great as to be almost inevitable. Alleged social benefits of boxing can never outweigh the medical consequences. Any debate about consequences will turn on how much importance you assign to the various outcomes. Here, both sides agree there is a risk, but they give different weight to that risk. And this is because they differ on how they interpret the same empirical evidence. What you have to remember in philosophy is that you're looking at how people arrive at their conclusions as much as the conclusions themselves.
What makes philosophy different is that it brings a greater attention to thinking well about those subject matters than the subject matters themselves. It is less concerned with the data than with critical reflection on the data. good thinking about the data, where I suppose that comes down effectively to arriving at clear and specific and also consistent and also complete accounts of those things.
I think philosophy does teach you to avoid absolutes and does teach you to question facile solutions. Everything in philosophy is so complicated and everything has so many possible different answers, and every position that any philosopher has ever taken up in the history of philosophy has been so immediately challenged by other philosophers that I think it does make you very cautious about accepting any simple answers to anything.
Very, very long time indeed. I do not see how he can let this go much.
As we've seen, the debate on whether boxing should be banned is very complicated, and there's no easy answer, and many paths you could take. It becomes even more difficult to unravel if we move on to a further line of argument about consequences, this time about the consequences for spectators.
He's brought the Albert Hall to a fever pitch of excitement. Minter visibly wilting. Could right.
Here, some more obviously philosophical issues are starting to emerge.
Ninth round, and the bells come. Nobody's heard the bell including...
I believe the time has come to ban boxing. I want to ban it for two reasons. The first is that it does physical damage to young men who ought to be protected against their misjudgments about their own future. The second is I think that it depresses and in many ways destroys the morality and the humanity of the people who watch it. I think it has a debilitating effect not simply on the boxers who take part, but on the men, I suppose some women, who sit round the ring howling for blood.
We get a couple of incredibly fit guys who are full of energy and bright-eyed and adrenaline, and they're ready to take each other on. This has always been rather thrilling for women, I think, ever since knights on horses fought each other for the hand of a lady. But apart from that, I like seeing... I think there's great courage displayed in boxing, and it is exciting to see people being that courageous that they know they might get hurt, they might even get killed, and yet it's admirable in a way to see this. It's something you don't see in normal life.
I think by definition, if you enjoy two men beating the hell out of each other, that's a corrupting prospect. And if you don't realise that's a corrupting prospect, all you're saying is that as well as being easily corruptible, you're insensitive. The two things may go together. I dare say that in Rome 2,000 years ago, there were people who said we don't regard it as corrupting to watch gladiators fight with leopards. Heavens above, or words to that Latin effect. You've got to be brave to fight a leopard. If you're prepared to stand there in the Colosseum with just a short sword and a net and take on a leopard, my word, you must be a courageous person. I feel uplifted by seeing it. But none of us would believe that was an uplifting or noble experience now. And people rationalising things. I mean, really what the boxing audience want to say is two young men beating each other into insensitivity. And it's not very different from watching it happen on a fairground or watching it happen on the street corner.
I think what's good about boxing is that it does cater for a savage side of ourselves in a very civilized way, and that's what makes it interesting. I don't think it inflames the savage side of us. I think it caters for it, which is quite different. And after all, if you saw a fight, or if I saw a fight in the street, I wouldn't feel at all thrilled by it. I'd be terrified if I saw two men in the middle of the road fighting bare-knuckled. I wouldn't know whether one was a victim, whether the other one was a bully. But in a ring with ambulances standing by and television cameras, I would feel that I was able to satisfy the violent side of myself without it doing any harm. As a spectator, in a way, achieving what the boxers do in the ring. So it's all very, very safe.
Roy Hattersley argues that spectators are corrupted by watching boxing, and Virginia Ironside that they're uplifted. Neither gives any scientific evidence to support their contentions, but they give weight to their argument by using analogies, comparing boxing with other activities. For instance, Roy Hattersley says that watching boxing is not significantly different from watching a street fight. Virginia Ironside argues that there are important differences between a boxing match and a street fight. The context in which they occur produces a completely different effect on the spectator. A good analogy relies on relevant similarities between the two cases compared. It's up to us. We have to judge which, if any, of these comparisons bring out relevant similarities. Now, at this point in the debate, an important philosophical question is about to emerge.
I think if two grown-up and responsible individuals would like to spend an hour beating the hell out of each other, why shouldn't they? And I think it's a very nannyish and patronising thing to say, oh, you shouldn't, little darlings, because your brains might go. It's up to us what we do with our brains. They're ours. It's rather like saying that everybody should stop smoking. People wish to puff themselves to death. Fine. Good for them.
I am an instinctive libertarian. I do not want to prohibit anything that it is unnecessary to prohibit. But I also know that liberty for the majority sometimes requires limitations on the individual actions of a minority. And I believe that if you're going to have a truly free society, you're going to have a society that respects individuals, respects individual rights and respects individual personas. And I think it's very difficult to have a society which respects individual personas, individual liberties, individual rights, if it's also a society that enjoys seeing young men beat each other to insensitivity.
To some people it's ugly, there's blood, and some people find it morally repugnant and unacceptable for two men to punch one another. They're entitled to their opinion. And, if they're happy, that they don't like boxing, they're entitled to have that opinion and switch the TV off. But, don't force that opinion on everybody else. The vast majority of people like it. It's a great sport. They like the physical contact. They like the skill, the adroit moves, the way these guys can defend themselves, the courage that they display, the dexterity, all of the skills that I've just talked about. The vast majority of people want to watch that. And, therefore they should be entitled to do that as well. And if the people don't like it, well then switch it off.
You're perfectly entitled to make all your own choices as long as those choices do not affect and damage other people. Now, your choices may affect and damage other people in a variety of ways. They may affect them directly by you saying, I want your property, I want to prevent you from doing this, I want you to prohibit you doing this, I want to tyrannize you. But they may affect you by saying, I'm influencing the society in which you live, and therefore by my behaviour I'm reducing your chance of living a decent and happy life. And I believe by promoting boxing you are reducing other people's chances of living a decent and happy life, and therefore you are affecting other people's lives. It is an infringement of their liberties. It is a limitation on what they want to do. And boxing is one of those things where freedom is, in my view, promoted by prohibiting it rather than reduced by prohibiting it. Paradoxes are always the most interesting parts of philosophy.
The issue here is, what are the limits of individual freedom in a civilised society? This question has occupied philosophers at least since Plato's time. Here we've got two contrasting views, both starting from the same principle, the principle that we should be free to do whatever we like on the sole condition we don't harm other people. The first view is that since boxers only harm themselves and always give consent to that harm, there's no reason to ban boxing. The suggestion is that you can't really be harmed if you give informed consent. On the other hand, Roy Hattersley argued that boxing morally corrupts those who watch it, and so harms society. So the same principle about harm can give rise to very different conclusions about boxing. It all depends on what you mean by harm. But there's also a related philosophical debate which is relevant here, the debate about paternalism. Paternalism is controlling what people do for their own good, or for the common good.
I myself believe that this is a real, true philosophical argument about the limits of individual freedom as when it conflicts with what we might think of as a common good, and that it's a tremendously interesting argument, but difficult to make absolutely clear, because I think every now and then we come up against something about which we may feel inclined to say, I just don't want to live in a society that permits this kind of thing. Well, I'm afraid if you move from there and say, bother of deliberate choice, it's still something uncivilized, you're now going to be accused of being paternalistic, maternalistic perhaps in my case. But at any rate, I'm saying I don't care whether they've chosen it freely. It's not something that I'm going to tolerate. And then you get into the argument about the limits of paternalism in the state, which I think is a very, very wide-ranging argument. I'm a great paternalist. I mean, I like having the fluoride in the water if that is for the common good. And I think if you are going to defend paternalism, then you've got to have a concept of the common good, not only with regard to things like tooth decay, but also with regard to things like what kind of spectacles you think that it is proper to show to the public, particularly now. The spectacle is something that can go on the television screen and absolutely everybody can see it.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the result.
We've just touched on some philosophical questions here. I hope we've demonstrated that by using critical thinking, it's possible to unravel some of the arguments that people use in real life. But also, I hope we've given you a taste of the really important questions which philosophy can tackle. Questions which have a profound effect on how we decide to live.
A unanimous decision. Barry McGuigan has won it.
McGuigan is the champion of the world. They've all voted for him, and all 25,000 people in the stadium had already voted for him.
For a copy of the current BBC Learning Zone programme guide, send an A4 stamped addressed envelope with the stamps to the value of 33p to BBC Learning Zone, room 2560, White City. The history of Rome's most famous tourist attraction on BBC Learning Zone now, the Emperor's Gift.
Even as a ruin, the Colosseum draws the crowds. It's a spectacle in itself and a central part of city life in Rome today. And in the ancient city of Rome, it also had a central place. To find out more about this, how and why the Colosseum was built and what it meant in the wider Roman world, we'll need to look at a range of evidence. But the obvious place to start is with the building itself.
To make this huge structure, stone had to be quarried, transported, assembled and shaped. Concrete had to be cast and bricks made. But after just 9 years, the amphitheatre was ready for the inaugural games in 80 CE.
Behind this impressive speed was the power and the wealth of the emperor. For the Colosseum was a gift to the people of Rome from the Emperor Vespasian. Its official name, the Flavian Amphitheatre, commemorates his family, the Flavii. Paid for from imperial funds, it was built on land which the Emperor Nero had taken for his own private palace less than 10 years before. Vespasian was the first emperor to give the city of Rome a permanent amphitheatre. Amphitheatres housed gladiatorial games or celebratory combat. This included fighting or displays of strength, gladiator with gladiator, gladiator with beast, beast with beast, or the punishment of criminals and prisoners. By custom, leading families and magistrates put on games like these. They'd begun as a way of commemorating important men at their death, but they became linked with another Roman tradition, that of celebrating public power and triumph. The size of the shows would vary depending on how much money was spent, but they were very much a public relations exercise. So the lavish games, funded by emperors in the Colosseum, were a statement of imperial wealth, munificence and power. And so was Vespasian's original gift of the building itself. An amphitheatre on such a scale was a visible and permanent reminder of who held the power and who was in control.
But amphitheatres weren't the only venue for public entertainment. Each venue required a particular space to suit its activities, as we can see in this model of ancient Rome. The circus, for instance, had a long track with a central spine for chariot racing. The design of shapes such as this developed over a long period from informal or temporary structures. Semicircular theatres stand out clearly from the complete circle of the amphitheatre, which is a good design for gladiatorial games. A large performance area with maximum visibility for the audience. The culmination of a long tradition and an imperial gift, the Colosseum was particularly massive and complex. And it's easier to begin to understand how it worked as an amphitheatre if we look at the earliest surviving example.
At the time the Colosseum was being built, the eruption of Vesuvius buried and preserved the stone amphitheatre at Pompeii, which had already stood for 160 years. It's a simple structure, which clearly shows the basic ingredients of an amphitheatre.
Its most obvious feature is the oval arena. As with the Colosseum, this gave the gladiators good space for both processions and combats, and allowed maximum visibility for the spectators, who sat on all sides on the grassy banks or the tiers of stone seating, a later improvement. The 5 front rows of seats were separated from the rest by a low wall. And in this section, the seats are more spacious.
Presumably, these wider seats were for the most important citizens, maybe including magistrates and benefactors to the games. And we know about some of them because they recorded their donations for the games. On the edge of the parapet between the seats and the arena are carved inscriptions. Prolud is an abbreviation of proludis, for the games. Another inscription commemorates the donation of the place for displays. Spectacular, which was made by 2 magistrates, duovir, as an act of honour, honoris. People of this rank may have sat in these front rows.
Access to these seats was via openings leading from a subterranean corridor. The same corridor also has steps off it to the lower tiers of the main seating. Then there are exterior stairs leading to the upper tiers.
Perhaps each of these different routes had a particular social significance and you were assigned an entrance. Or perhaps they just gave access to the different levels of the amphitheatre and you could sit more or less anywhere.
The seating of this amphitheatre was created by scooping out the soil at the centre of the site and banking it up at the edges, leaving the level floor of the arena lower than the ground outside. And the corridors which lead out of it run at quite a sharp slope. A retaining wall was needed to keep the earth banks in place, and this was formed partly by the existing city wall and partly by an arcade of buttresses. And it's the arcade and the staircases which are the distinctive features of this amphitheatre.
This wall painting shows a riot which broke out in Pompeii between its people and those of the neighbouring town of Nuceria in 59 CE. As a result, the Pompeians were forbidden to hold gladiatorial games for 10 years, a punishment which gives an indication of the game's importance in the social life of the town.
In Rome, the Colosseum presents a grander picture compared to Pompeii. This amphitheatre isn't made by banking up soil. It's entirely built up from the ground. The great outer wall rises to 157 feet and is divided into 4 tiers. The distinctive features here are the 3 tiers of round arches divided by columns. These columns are mainly decorative, and there's a different style or order on each floor. The lowest arcade has simple Tuscan columns. Above that are more elegant Ionic, while the top arcade has richer Corinthian capitals. Above these is a plain wall with flat strips called pilasters. This section's actually a later addition. Compared to the earlier provincial amphitheatre at Pompeii, the exterior of the Colosseum is much more sophisticated. Imperial funding may explain some of this grandeur, but the pattern of the exterior wall follows one which had already been tried in a major building in Rome, the Theatre of Marcellus, which was dedicated some 90 years earlier than the Colosseum. There may be other architectural precedents, but here on the theatre's exterior you can see how the tall arches are flanked by pairs of columns, again with a different order on each floor. But at the Colosseum, the arches are wider in relation to their height. It's a better proportion, giving a sense of space and elegance. And here, the appearance and the function of the building go hand in hand, because these arches form the outer edge of a honeycomb of arcades. They're lighter in weight than the solid earth bank, but quite strong enough to make this vast structure stand up.
The Colosseum catered for very large audiences, 50,000 as opposed to 20,000 at Pompeii. These arcades provided foyer space for the crowds, and at ground level, each arch provides a way in. The arches are numbered, each the beginning of a separate route to the seats. This is arch number 38, of a total of 80. But the arch next to it has no number. What's the significance here?
There are some clues in the building itself. The stone has discoloured at a different rate, and the way the cornice has been cut away suggests that something else was attached which has been destroyed. That could have been a porch or portico. And if these are the remains of the columns from it, it must have been very grand. The importance of this entrance is confirmed by traces of decorative plaster, which were probably painted and gilded.
It was clearly very special, and is matched by another entrance opposite, which only remains now as a partial reconstruction. Both these lead directly to ringside boxes, presumably reserved for the emperor and other dignitaries. Other entrances lead into the heart of the building and up a single flight of stairs to the front seats. Entering by different doorways, a series of routes would take you up different stairways to the various sections of the upper tiers. This physical arrangement of staircases and entrances ties in with regulations described by Roman historians. These allocated different levels of seating in the arena to different levels of Roman society, all presided over by the emperor from his box. As in Pompeii, the rows nearest the arena were reserved for the dignitaries. In Rome, these were the senators. Above the senators sat other male citizens according to rank and wealth. Women and slaves were restricted to the top of the building. Their seats were the furthest away from the action in the arena.
Little remains of the seating itself. There's just this one patch, where the marble fragments are pieced out with brick restoration. Instead, we see exposed like a sort of skeleton the complex structure that underpinned this vast auditorium. There's a whole range of materials used, allowing both the most economical and the speediest construction. Much of it's brick and concrete. Roman concrete's a sort of porridge with lumps in it. There's brick, a piece of roof tile, and chunks of stone. One of the stones is tufa, a volcanic rock you can actually cut with a saw. This piece, which is not a bit of the Colosseum, tufa outcrops naturally all round Rome, shows you that it's very crumbly and breaks quite easily. It's no good at all for fine carving. On the other hand, it's capable of sustaining great weight, so that apart from bulking out concrete, it's also ideal for plain walling, because it's light, cheap, and easy to work. The builders clearly understood the properties of each material, using different materials for different parts of the structure. They chose fine stone for the exterior and the internal skeleton. There are great piers of hard white travertine stone with big brown blocks of tufa forming the wall between them. Above that, the walls of concrete faced with brick. On the whole surface was given a coating of smooth plaster. Finally, above each staircase or passageway was a concrete vault which carried the seating. The whole building depended on this system of vaults. Some of the vaults run the whole way round the arena at different levels. Intersecting with these are others that radiate from the arena. Beneath the vaults was ample space for the entrances and for simply milling around. Above these passages, all the vaults were joined up to provide a unified slope for the seating. And the slope was pierced by openings from the various stairs.
The end result was an enormous and imposing structure with a grand facade. But in the centuries since the Colosseum was built, it's seen much damage. Features have been lost, sections have fallen down or have been repaired. This makes it difficult to recapture details of the original appearance and function. For instance, there's evidence that amphitheatres could be covered to provide protection from the elements. An awning is clearly visible in the painting from Pompeii. But how did this work over the massive span of the Colosseum?
It's likely that these bollards were part of the system. Imagine guy ropes attached to them, securing masts or beams on top of the building. These projections could support the foot of a mast, slotted through these holes. But we don't know quite how the whole thing functioned.
This is yet another example of the sorts of questions the building raises. Many relate to the arena. Although it originally had a flat surface for the games, 19th century excavations revealed that this covered a complex network of chambers.
Here, below ground level, we now see corridors. Some with rooms leading off them, and there are various entrances into both the arena and the subterranean chambers.
From information about who and what took part in the games, we can begin to build up a picture of how this area was used. Some of the rooms must have held criminals and prisoners awaiting their turn in the arena, and others used to house the personnel and saw the props and scenery which lavish shows demanded. Wild animals were driven into the building via this corridor and kept securely in rooms until the time came for them to be sent up to the arena. Then they were lifted up in cages and driven by firebrand along platforms. They were then released into the arena through trapdoors in its floor. Leading in and out of the arena are corridors by which the gladiators entered in procession and left after their fights, dead or alive. The games were popular because they were exciting. The gladiators' flashing armour, the shouting, the fighting, the heat, the smells, the death. Accompanying all this was music and applause. And if we want to continue this exploration into the games and their value in Roman society, we need to look beyond this building. Even a small town like Pompeii could experience the thrills of the arena.
On its streets, forthcoming attractions at the amphitheatre were advertised. Here's notice of the completion of a public building being celebrated by a benefactor with a procession of gladiators, a pompa, and a venatio, an animal show, and athleti, athletes. Doodled figures of gladiators have been found scratched on the wall where people queued for the theatre. They've also been found in private houses in Pompeii.
As well as being portrayed in graffiti, gladiators' status and popularity was reflected in more permanent art, like floor mosaics. Whether freeborn or slaves, gladiators were shown as glamorous stars in daring combat. Such glamour was also enjoyed by the specialist beast fighters, depicted in this 3rd century mosaic from Tunisia. The inscriptions reveal that its main purpose is to praise the generosity of the show's promoter, Magarius. But the real stars of the scene are the fighters and the animals, all of whom are named as individuals. These images reflect the fascination which gladiators held for the public as heroic figures on the margins of ordinary society. In Rome, the Colosseum was where these stars performed. The killing of animals and people was witnessed by the community, seated all around and according to social rank. This represented Roman society's attempt at control over its potential wild and deviant elements. So the culture of the arena provided wider Roman culture with a new range of social metaphors for the conquest of the wild and its subjugation to law and order. This building became a microcosm of the whole empire under Rome's control. This symbolism was echoed in the way in which amphitheatres and their activities spread throughout the Roman world. So what did the games mean in places far from Rome? Amphitheatres were a sign of Roman civilization. They marked a town which had embraced a Roman lifestyle. Certainly they were very popular, and beyond the usual excitements, gave local communities a chance to replicate activities of Central Roman culture in their own context. Local dignitaries like Magarius, bought local favour by funding their own shows. So he was doing in his community in North Africa what the emperor did in Rome. Like the Colosseum, this mosaic is a permanent reminder of the power of his money, and through the image of the slaughtered animals, even hints at power over the natural world. In some regions, like North Africa, this power over nature involved the capture of wild animals to be shipped back to Rome for the big city shows. At one level, this transport became a major trade, which created local entrepreneurs and middlemen of wealth and influence. At another, it created a kind of ironic symbolism, as provinces captured and sent to the capital their own wild animals. There, they were slaughtered in events which came to represent Rome's control over her territories. Thus, there was a complex two-way process. The culture of Rome spread outwards across the empire via the games and the passionate enthusiasm they generated. In return, animals, and sometimes humans, were sent back as fodder for Roman audiences. According to one contemporary cynic, bread and circuses were what the Romans wanted. In giving the Colosseum to the city of Rome, Vespasian certainly was providing a permanent site for popular entertainment on a huge scale. But the emperor's gift also expressed the two-way relationships between emperor and people, between capital and provinces, that underpinned the whole Roman Empire.
Ancient meets modern on BBC Learning Zone now, computers and the arts.
Don't be in the dark about programmes from the Open University. The Ozone magazine gives you a complete guide with full listing information and much more. For your free copy, call us on 0870 900 0303 or log on to our website at www.open2.net.
Now on BBC Two, BBC Learning Zone takes an alternative view of the stadium known as the venue of legends.
Wembley Stadium. This temple of sport, with its twin towers, will be familiar to most. If only from television, most of us will recognise the great sweep of the seating, the manicured green turf of the pitch, with the dog track round it, and at one end, the famous tunnel from which the players emerged at the brilliance and space of the arena and the roar of the crowds. Wembley's surely the best-known football stadium in the whole UK. For 3/4 of a century, it's hosted some of the greatest football matches. Cup finals, World Cup matches, and so on. They even call it the venue of legends. But just what does that title mean? What makes a legend? In football, I suppose it depends on who's playing and whether it's a hard-fought game or not. This looks like an easy goal.
Hurst, he's got some people are on the pitch, they think it's all over. It is now. It's four.
That goal, in the closing seconds of a World Cup final, certainly has legendary status. Some matches are memorable in themselves. But it was the policeman on the white horse who made Wembley's first football match famous. And Wembley has been host to other legendary events, from dog racing and Mick the Miller, to rugby league, from Olympic Games to gymnastic displays, from religious ceremonies to rock concerts. Wembley has seen them all. We need to ask why this building suits the sorts of events that create legends. Why did the events come here in the first place? And then, what effect have those legends had on this building? The stadium's a familiar landmark, and the Twin Towers have come to symbolise England's premier sporting venue. Yet Wembley has recently been described as uncomfortable, unsuitable and outdated. It's quite surprising that with all its faults, the building still commands affection and still has legendary status itself. One factor that overrides many of the discomforts is the power of tradition. Wembley Stadium has a history. When it was first built in 1922-3, it was intended to be the latest thing in stadium design. The most modern materials, steel and ferroconcrete, were used, allowing the stadium to be erected in a mere 300 days. Designed to accommodate over 120,000 spectators, it's held up by a network of surprisingly light steel girders. These support reinforced concrete beams and concrete terraces. The architects claimed it was the largest monumental reinforced concrete structure in the world. This was the cutting edge of engineering in the 1920s. The designers called for elaborate tests to ensure that the structure would perform effectively. An army of 1,200 men sat and swayed and stamped in unison for an hour to see if there were any signs of structural weakness. There weren't, and the stadium was ready just in time for the Bolton-West Ham Cup final of 1923. This was the legendary White Horse Cup final. It was a bold move by the FA to commit the cup final to an untried ground and to sign a 21-year contract. But Wembley offered first-class facilities. There were proper terraces on all sides, with safety barriers, and covered seating for 20,000. There was good reason for the grandeur of the stadium. Not only was it to be a fine home for a popular sport, and an advance on some of the less glamorous club grounds, but the stadium was also to be a central feature of the British Empire Exhibition of 1924, an exhibition that spread over a 216-acre site to the north of the stadium. Britain was setting out to display its wares, and through them its power, on this new site. First thought of in 1913, plans for a British Empire exhibition were launched in 1919, when it was felt that out of the ashes of the First World War would rise a new Commonwealth of Nations with a new faith in the future. The exhibition was intended to further this ideal, and it affords a glimpse of the cultural temperature of Britain at the time. To understand why the stadium was built the way it was, we need to understand the exhibition it was part of. Everything at Wembley should be the newest, the biggest, and of course the best, including the stadium. So it's no surprise to find the stadium's foundation stone was laid by the Duke of York, and the exhibition opened by the King at a ceremony in the stadium. This involvement of royalty set the building firmly within the structure of British society, and British history was celebrated in the opening events. In fact, the events in the stadium focused on imperial history and power, reflecting Edwardian and Victorian imperial values, and the assumption that Britain was the dominant mother country. This imperial hierarchy is also reflected in the various shapes of the buildings. The British Government Pavilion was a solid-looking structure with a centrepiece like a Greek temple. A row of imperial British lions crouched along the terrace. Inside, the grey walls of the Court of Honour were hung with the royal coat of arms, the arms of the dominions and protectorates and the provinces of India, while at the visitors' feet a vast relief map displayed the geographical extent of empire. The official guide even contained a map of the empire, with all the pink bits on which the sun never set. The British Empire exhibition was a display of the political and economic power of the empire, and a celebration of its history and permanence. The Government Pavilion was reached by a reconstruction of Old London Bridge, while all around were separate pavilions for each of the nations of the empire. Significantly, the more westernised countries opted for traditional classical forms, with pillars and pediments, like the Government Pavilion. The Indian Pavilion, a sort of distant cousin of the Taj Mahal, reflected India's importance to the empire by its size and splendour. Other countries, such as Hong Kong and Burma, built structures reflecting their different ethnic architectures. Each nation displayed the produce it considered most typical. A huge gold ball represented South African mineral wealth. Australia's wool was similarly shown by a trophy that measured 16 feet in diameter. Perhaps the most extraordinary of these displays was a life-size statue of the Prince of Wales, sculpted in Canadian butter. A curiosity, certainly, but also a demonstration of modern science in its massive refrigerated case that kept it fresh all through the summer of 1924. Curiosity aside, the exhibition was very much a trade fair. British trade and manufactures were displayed in two vast palaces of industry and engineering, which contained examples of the sort of heavy engineering that had allowed the British Empire to survive. But there was a stress on progress in the section devoted to transport. The 1920s was the beginning of the era of the mass-produced car, when personal transport was just beginning to be widespread. This display was effectively the start of the motor show, a trade fair that flourishes still. The British Empire exhibition was enormously popular, attracting 17.5 million visitors.
It is a family party to which every part of the empire is invited, and at which every part of the empire is represented.
There was no mistaking who was head of the family, but there really was a good deal of party atmosphere. One part of the exhibition site was given over to a 47-acre amusement park, described as the greatest aggregation of amusements in the world, with the King and Queen even trying the scenic railway. But the exhibition was more than just a fair. The Wembley Guide went so far as to say,
"The British Empire is the greatest the world has ever seen. The British Empire exhibition is the most wonderful product of that empire."
This was the context that gave rise to the huge new stadium, an imperial centrepiece set on the crest of the hill.
There is not in all England a building that can compete with the Empire Stadium in the effect it creates in the mind of the spectator. In design, it is vast and imposing. In construction, it has the solid quality that appears to defy time. In point of size, it challenges comparison with anything of the kind in the world. The stadium covers more than 10 acres. Rome's immortal Colosseum would be lost within it. In a world that has developed so great a devotion to sport, there is no arena that can compare with Wembley's.
The stadium was designed to be much more than merely a football ground. The very shape echoes the Roman Colosseum. The comparison made in that quote is no accident. Probably built as a conscious reference to this imperial centrepiece, Wembley's round arches recall those of the Colosseum. And, on the exterior facade, are found traces of classical detailing. The use of this architectural style says much about how the original designers wanted this building to be read. And, like the Colosseum in its day, this stadium also was to be thoroughly modern, using the latest material. The ancient Colosseum was designed with massive, load-bearing walls. But Wembley Stadium is an early example of reinforced concrete construction, which allows the arches to be much wider and lighter than the builders of the Roman Colosseum could ever imagine. Wembley Stadium combines the different virtues of concrete and steel. Although it looks immensely solid from a distance, it's all light ferroconcrete construction. There's a frame with steel rods inside here which is set up first, and then a wooden mould or shuttering is put up and the wet concrete poured into it. You can actually see the marks made by the planks here. But when it's dry, the ribbed surface and the horizontal grooves help to conceal the joins between each day's casting and make it look like massive stonework. Actually, the wall's only about 2.5 inches thick, so a deeply recessed window like this one needs to be boxed out on the inside. This sort of false solidity might seem an odd way of going about things, but the point was to make the building look imposing. So I don't find it surprising that this was by echoing a classical amphitheatre. This structure has most of the same functional constraints as the Colosseum, and so can make use of the same architectural shapes. Under the seats of the Colosseum, large vaulted arcades served as foyers. Wembley's extensive foyer area is also tucked into the space under the seating. Here, the ceiling mimics the Roman vaulting, but this space houses a large bar, originally the longest straight bar in the world, designed to supply the needs of reporters and others attending the events. And numbers of people and their needs were crucial in the design of this place. Wembley management quickly learned that it had to provide easy access for very large crowds. The first cup final wasn't even an all-ticket affair, and many of the 200,000 spectators simply climbed in. The Roman solution to crowds like these had been numbered entrances, leading through arcaded foyers, up a series of stairways, and so out through archways into the tiered seating. At Wembley, the outer arches are now fitted with turnstiles and lettered. Beside them rise staircase towers, each of which contains a pair of interlocking stairs that lead right to the top of the seating. At the lower level, a spacious foyer opens through numbered arches to the middle tiers. In this way, Wembley could accommodate more than twice as many as the Colosseum. And Wembley's games, like the Roman Ludi, were presided over by royalty, who passed through a more elegant private foyer to the reserved royal box. The fact that the King and Queen attended may have helped to swell the crowds. It certainly put an official seal of approval on the stadium and the activities there. The royal box placed like the Roman emperors at the Colosseum on the short axis of the pitch, not only allows an excellent view of the game, it's also the place where, in full view of the crowds, the coveted cup can be presented. The link between the pleasure and passion of the sport and the formal institutions of the monarchy helps to form the way in which we react to Wembley Stadium.
England are the world champions.
Because the stadium was a part of the British Empire exhibition, this temple of sport acquired an immediate status in the minds of the public at large. The stadium has survived, but what of the other buildings? The hope was that they'd be a permanent and lasting monument to British imperial leadership. The exhibition guide claimed,
"It is as well to insist that here we have no ephemeral structure designed to endure for a season and to pass thereafter into desolation and decay. The material chiefly used at Wembley for construction is concrete with steel. No other foundation would serve the purpose of empire."
The exhibition buildings, however, didn't have a very long design life. They were little better than industrial sheds with smart facades. And those facades weren't really solid enough to survive without regular attention. The stadium has had just that, and we need to ask why this, of all the buildings, was able to command the affection and fulfill the needs of succeeding generations. The exhibition brought the stadium into being, but it was sport that gave it a future. When the British Empire exhibition closed, the stadium was bought for about a quarter of what it had cost to build, and few people believed it could be run at a profit. The purchaser, Arthur, later Sir Arthur Elvin, was one of the demolition contractors of the exhibition site, who'd even succeeded in selling off some of the smaller structures, including the concrete lions, for removal wholesale to other locations. What was important for the stadium was that he managed to get the remaining 19 years of the Football Association's contract transferred to him with the stadium. Thus, there was a use in place when his company began. Arthur Elvin also arranged for other events to be played here that would broaden the scope of his stadium. Wembley had been designed as a multi-purpose structure, and so could easily host events such as dog racing, still the most regular event at Wembley. The Rugby League Cup final was first played here in 1929. In this way, Arthur Elvin set out to establish a secure commercial basis for his company. He also provided the opportunity for other legends to be created. In 1932, Elvin added a vast covered swimming pool, now the Wembley Arena. This could be floored over for other events, and wasn't used as a pool during the war years. But the presence of this facility, together with the stadium, made Wembley an ideal location for the first post-war Olympics in 1948. In that post-war austerity, there was neither money nor materials to build a new stadium. Wembley hadn't been damaged in the war, and already had the facilities to make it an Olympic venue. The 1948 Games were widely seen as a contrast to the previous Olympics that had been held in Berlin. The stadium there, completed in 1936, was deliberately designed to house those Olympics. Even more than at Wembley, there are echoes of the Roman Colosseum, providing a suitably imperial language. Here, the architecture was intended as a demonstration of the superiority of the Third Reich and the forward-looking nature of the Nazi state. And that modernity is shown in the simple, square-cut shapes that look so dramatic in Leni Riefenstahl's film of the Olympic Games that Hitler was so proud to host. But the association of the Olympiastadion with the Nazi Party has left it with an altogether ambiguous meaning for us today. The 1948 Olympics acquired a rather different meaning, something of a celebration of peace and liberation, sharing perhaps something of the original hopes of the British Empire exhibition for a new faith in the future. But the worldwide gathering of athletes and the events of an Olympic Games did require some modification of the stadium. A new and larger tunnel was made to accommodate the great parade of athletes. This is the famous tunnel which is still in use today. Originally, the players entered at the opposite end of the pitch through a narrow passage. On the other hand, it was relatively easy to convert the 1920s dog track to an athletics track. And it was on that track that Emil Zatopek won his gold medal in the 10,000 metres.
Up to the finish, and Zatopek wins in 29 minutes, 59.6 seconds. Yet another Olympic record achieved in truly heroic style.
Olympic successes are permanently recorded on the outside of the stadium. Fanny Blankers-Koen won no less than 3 gold medals. These are the sort of events that become legends. And of course, the fact that these were Olympic Games, again with royalty present, further enhanced the status of Wembley Stadium as a national temple of sport. One of the ways that legends are preserved is on film, and it was in 1948 that television first came to Wembley. The installation of cameras was one of the first modifications that brought Wembley into the electronic age. The ultra-modern stadium of 1924 needed continuous adaptation to stay abreast of technological improvements. Until 1963, most of the stadium had been unroofed. Then a cantilevered steel covering was set up to support the massive awning that's part of Wembley today. 10 years earlier, Wembley had at last acquired floodlighting. The new roof allowed that to be further improved with more lighting towers. Wembley was late getting this facility, but at last it was possible to hold evening fixtures. Wembley needed to keep pace with the developing demands of its main sport. And there were further improvements for crowd control and safety. The passion felt for sport has often led to pitch invasions.
One of them thinks it. And a great tackle, almost on the line.
But one fan is a different case from the thousands at that first White Horse Cup final. Miraculously, no one was hurt then, but huge crowds do bring a risk. In April 1989, the surge of a crowd into one stand of the Hillsborough Ground in Sheffield had a horrific outcome. As a result, British football grounds were modified to become all-seater. In fact, Wembley had already taken the decision to install seats, and its new Olympic Gallery was opened in May 1989. As facilities gradually improved, Wembley was able to attract a wider variety of events and to reach an audience even wider than the tens of thousands who came as worshippers of one particular sport or another. When Pope John Paul II came to Britain, Wembley was the setting for a papal mass.
With its massive cross beneath the twin towers of Wembley and the crowds stretched across the famous turf, this was by far the largest gathering the Pope has encountered so far.
Pilgrims of a different kind filled the stadium to raise funds to fight famine, and Live Aid was born.
Coming together.
But such events, legendary though they may be, don't sustain the venue. It's as the home of major football matches, the function for which it was first used, that Wembley has really acquired legendary status.
McNabby outside, he's round the back. Clock! 1-0.
It's the passion aroused by matches such as these, the legendary events of this sporting mecca, that brings crowds from far and wide. London Underground's contribution to the pilgrimage is a rebuilding of the access from their station. This is part of a Millennium scheme to improve the whole experience of Wembley. Fans arrive at the start of Olympic Way, at the far end of which the twin towers of the stadium still beckon like the gateway to a shrine. Indeed, this view has become deeply embedded in the minds of all who follow English football, as well as many others. The stadium is inseparable from its legends. But there's an inherent problem. The oval layout of the original stadium, with a single slope of seating, means that some spectators are a long way from the action. It's been calculated that more than half the spectators at Wembley are beyond the optimum viewing distance, and as many as 20% beyond the recommended maximum distance. This makes the stadium less than ideal for football, and there are many who want to demolish and build from scratch a new wonder stadium that will be the latest thing for the new millennium. This would make a fitting national stadium for English football. But what of its history? In this design for the new stadium, the twin towers are carefully preserved, though everything else is replaced. The most conspicuous element of the 1923 stadium has become the symbol of this place as a venue of legends, able to survive even the obsolescence of the building itself.
Learn another language, find a new career, improve your computing skills. Do it all with BBC Learning Zone. Find out more at bbc.co.uk/.
Forget movies about gladiators. The OU has the real story behind the Roman games on BBC Learning Zone now in Passing Judgments.
But historically, it's a false image. There's almost no evidence that any Christians were martyred in the Colosseum. Most of the slaughter took place in the provincial arenas. And yet, from the very earliest days of cinema, it was an accepted historical fact.
One of the first stunning, spectacular examples of the representation of the arena as a place where Christians are thrown to lions is in a film called Quo Vadis that was made in Italy in 1913. And the film is actually centred in the history of the reign of Nero, because Nero was seen as the first emperor who persecuted Christians. The Colosseum didn't exist in the time of Nero. Nonetheless, it has to figure now in this film because it is the place we all know where the Christians died. So when the film reaches the moment where we see the emperor watching the death of Christians, it is the Colosseum to which the filmmakers turn for their inspiration.
The images which filmmakers used were taken largely from 19th century representations of the arena. There's a long artistic tradition of arena paintings and drawings which graphically portray the suffering of the innocent and the savagery of the pagan. The French artist Jean-Léon Gérôme made a number of paintings based on Roman games. As viewers, we're asked to identify with victims rather than spectators.
Now, what cinema does with those paintings is quite extraordinary, because it gives them movement, it gives them a storyline, it gives the spectators in the cinema an opportunity to experience the arena from the point of view of those who are suffering in it. A large part of the time, the camera follows the gladiators as they fight. It gives you close-ups of the Christians, and we are given a chance to experience the amphitheatre from the point of view of those in the arena rather than those who are spectating. In that context, we have the complete antithesis of what the amphitheatre was about in the ancient world, because in this narrative, the emperor is the criminal. The emperor is the beast who is making Christians suffer, and the Christians in the arena are those who are heroic.
So, cinema takes up themes and perspectives from paintings. 19th century artists took a judgmental view of the games. They could sometimes focus with disapproval upon the crowds. This painting by Simeon Solomon is called Habet, the Latin for he has it or he's bought it. It shows female spectators who are looking down at a wounded gladiator about to die.
This is a very powerful painting because we're focusing on the women and on the variety of passions, of the emotions that they're feeling as they're looking. They're feeling the whole gamut of emotions that you could possibly feel in relation to an event like this. We've got feelings of fear, of anxiety, of distress, of desire, of cruelty, of sadism. The central woman is looking there. She has very full lips, a very full throat. It's almost as if she's drinking in the spectacle, and she's dressed in bright red, which kind of picks up the idea of the blood that she's actually looking at. And the blonde woman on her right has got her lips slightly parted. She's quite excited by this sight. She's giving the thumbs down. She wants the gladiator to be killed. And so she's very excited by the spectacle. Now, I think this really epitomised the Victorian attitudes towards Roman women, and it's a way of saying to the Victorian audience that he's painting for, we're superior in our society, we're superior to these people. Look at these games, these degrading spectacles that the Romans actually enjoyed.
But there was another aspect to the historical depictions of the Colosseum. Even as a ruin, it was an impressive sight, and it could still function as a powerful symbol of empire, the glory that was Rome. This alternative image was also exploited in the 20th century.
Mussolini undertakes an incredibly ambitious urban project that involves creating a broad avenue that leads to the Colosseum, past the Roman forums, to suggest, as the fascists held these grand military parades down the avenue from the Colosseum to the Piazza Venezia, which was the headquarters of the fascist government, that the actual parade was linking the grandeur of the ancient Roman Empire with the current grandeur of the modern Italian Empire. Now, at the very same time as this image of the Colosseum was being created, in Hollywood, Cecil B. DeMille made a film called The Sign of the Cross.
Film can manipulate our perceptions. While Hollywood restated its own traditions by focusing on the sufferers in the arena, Mussolini reclaimed its imperial status by focusing on the grandeur of the building. Either way, we are still spectators. But what about the audiences in ancient Rome? How did they view the games? If we want to understand the games from the Roman point of view, we have to shift our gaze. The first change we have to make is in the very word we use, games.
The combats that went on in the amphitheatre in the Roman period are called games, Spiele, jeux, in European languages today. But it's worth remembering that for the Romans, they were not ludi, they were not games. The Romans also had games. These games were put on as religious ceremonies in honour of the gods, but gladiatorial combats were something different. The Romans used the word munus to describe this activity, and that's the same word that they used for funerals. The munus was something that you had an obligation to give to honour a dead person. And that, I think, means that we want to be quite careful about using our modern concepts like entertainment, when we look at these institutions of a quite different culture.
Provincial arenas like Pompeii might be used for munera and ludi. Ludi were displays of military skill, acrobatics, even tightrope walking. The Colosseum was the place for the spectacular munera. The day was divided into 3 parts. The morning involved the slaughter of wild beasts. Midday was for the execution of condemned criminals. They were butchered by fighters in unequal combat or thrown to wild beasts. Sometimes they were forced to play a deadly part in the reenactment of myths. The afternoon was reserved for skilled gladiator combat. Although gladiators could be volunteers, they were usually criminals or prisoners of war. These events demonstrated how those judged and condemned were paying the penalty in a spectacular way. It was as much part of the judicial process as it was gory entertainment for the masses.
I think one of the most dangerous misconceptions about the games in the arena is that it's a purely gratuitously violent spectacle. And you often hear the games discussed in terms of modern parallels such as slasher films, snuff movies, video nasties and so forth. And I think that's very misleading because that completely ignores the whole cultural status of the games within Roman culture as something which really underpins all kinds of ideas that they have about being Roman and Roman virtues and so on.
In an empire which spanned over 2 continents, with no equivalent of a modern police force and few permanent prisons, some kind of visible retribution for those who transgressed was socially significant. The munera were a public and ritualised punishment.
If you think about how the whole process of justice is ritualised in contemporary Britain, this becomes much more comprehensible, I think. The way that a judge is dressed up in anachronistic clothing. The whole setting is very formulaic and ritualized. I think exactly the same processes are going on in the arena.
So the games were a form of public execution, more akin to the types of execution we know from modern periods of history. But there's no doubt that this was a particularly spectacular form of public execution.
Escort to the column! Change! Out! Slow! March!
Pageant and ceremony are used extensively by Western cultures as a way of expressing national identity and community. So too, Roman games were an expression of Roman citizenship. But to be a Roman citizen was more than our modern notion of nationality. Notions of citizenship justified the very existence of the games. Romans made a sharp distinction between those who were citizens and those who were not.
I think that this is probably one of the ways that people who were watching the games managed to negotiate the violence that was going on there for themselves, because they weren't making the identification between viewer and viewed that we seem to presuppose now as being the crucial part of any spectacle. So as they watched, they didn't necessarily see themselves being tortured and mutilated. They saw somebody inferior, perhaps even somebody they thought of as being differently physically constituted. So it was different grades of humanity that were on display there, lower grades.
Our concept of humanity is a very all-embracing concept.
I love each and every one of you.
We have this idea of the human race, of humanitarian aid, of compassion that underlies a lot of actions that we make as human beings. We find links between ourselves and other people. Now, I think the Roman idea of humanity, the Latin word is humanitas, is very different from the modern 20th century idea. It's a way of making divisions. It's a very exclusive concept. It draws lines between us and them. And nowhere can you see this more clearly than in the Colosseum, in the gladiatorial arena, where there is an us, which is the spectators, all united in terms of watching the games, and there's a them. And those are the people that are there to be dispatched, to be killed, to just be an object of spectacle.
Presenting and introducing in this corner, ladies and gentlemen, from Crayford, the heavyweight champion of Europe, Lennox Lewis.
It's very difficult when we try to look at the feelings of spectators and participants in an activity in the context of a different culture to be certain that they are feeling the sorts of things that we feel. And it may be helpful to look at what went on in the arena not just as gladiators being killed, but in a sense as of gladiators who had been marked out to die, proving by their fighting ability they could persuade the assembled people that they actually deserved to live, so that what the people saw in the arena was not just men facing death, but actually men overcoming death because they had the fighting skill, the virtue to fight, which marked out the ideal Roman.
In relatively recent times, people flocked to see a public execution. Although the Roman games had a judicial flavour, it's perhaps implausible to suggest that Roman citizens didn't feel pleasure or excitement at what they saw.
They didn't sit stony-faced at all, very much the opposite. It's true that these were judicial executions that were going on in many of the cases. They were criminals who'd been sentenced to fight in the arena. That may have made it respectable, but they did not sit stony-faced. Augustine has the most gripping story of how his friend Alypius was determined not to go and watch in the arena. But his friends took him, and so he went and shut his eyes. But when there was a great roar in the crowd, he opened his eyes and he saw the blood flowing, and then he was hooked. And Augustine uses lots of metaphors of drinking to correspond with the blood flowing. He drank it all in, and from that moment he was hooked and went back and back and back.
Despite their popularity across the Roman Empire, there was criticism from philosophers like Cicero and Seneca, who believed the arena was dangerous for the spectators, arousing all kinds of irrational emotions.
We get this very interesting letter of Cicero in which he's describing some games put on by Pompey, the great general Pompey, in which he'd brought on some elephants to be the coup de théâtre in the show. This was meant to be the climax. The spectators would adore Pompey for providing them with this novel spectacle. But it misfires. It misfires because the spectators suddenly start feeling pity, misericordia, for these elephants. They feel that they're almost human, that there's a feeling of community with them in their suffering. And this is not at all the idea of what you're supposed to be evoking as somebody who's staging these games.
It was considered irrational to feel pity for slaughtered animals because they had no kinship with the human race. They had no kinship because they didn't possess the power of reason. When the Romans commented on the slaughter of humans, the criticism tended to be on the effect it had on the spectators, not on the suffering of the victims.
In those days, emotion was a really big subject. There was a minority view that if you had difficulty coping with your emotions, you should go to the doctor, but far more of the ancient people thought you should go to the philosopher. So this is part of a whole climate in which philosophers talked about avoiding emotions, or at any rate avoiding the wrong emotions. And the focus was on the wrong emotions that you get by going to the Colosseum or going to watch these bloodthirsty games. The focus was not on the terrible things that were happening to the killed humans or animals.
The disturbing effect of spectacle was ironically echoed by critics of the 1930s film The Sign of the Cross.
What's very interesting about Cecil B. DeMille's film is also sold to the masses as a spectacle in which you could see the glitter, the thrills, the excitement of a period when Rome was at the height of its power, but the depths of its depravity. And Cecil B. DeMille offered the most extraordinary fantasy on Colosseum themes. So he, prior to the morally uplifting moment when we see Christians being thrown to the lions, we're offered gladiatorial contests, elephants, tigers. Now, that whole sequence of the film was responded to in the press in some ways a bit like the anxieties that have been expressed elsewhere about what used to happen in antiquity, in which such cinema spectacle could deprave and corrupt its audiences.
The American actor and former football star O.J. Simpson is in jail tonight, accused of murdering his ex-wife and her male friend. His arrest came after a 50-mile police chase across Southern California, which was broadcast live on national television.
Spectacle was, and still is, very seductive. The Roman arena put on the drama of men fighting for their lives. The maintenance of law and order was on display, and this drew the crowds. In many modern cultures, public executions and naked expressions of political coercion are unacceptable. But the rhetoric of punishments fitting crime and justice being seen to be done, reassuring the public that they are secure from threat. This is a common agenda. If we are to view the past critically and to pass judgment, we had best be prepared to look closely at our present.
I was always interested in art. Now I want to understand it. You don't need a history of art degree to work in a gallery, but sometimes it helps. Whoever you are, wherever you are, the Open University comes to you. To find out more, call us on 0870 900 9584.
Now, BBC Learning Zone, the Open University finds a link between computers and music.
The Drake Project in South East London are leading the way in using computer technology to enable disabled people to make music. We visited one of their workshops to find out more. Can you tell us about this technology, what it's called and how it works?
Yes, sure. This one that we're using here is called MIDI Creator. It has a series of inputs on this side, and I'll show you this particular one. That's the one we were using earlier on. It's a MIDI sensor, and it picks up movement. So we use some of Baz's movement. We've got a good bit of movement here, so we look at the distance between the black box and his knee, and he's able to control that and play the music that way.
It was Adele Drake who founded the project in about 1985, 1986. She just had a great idea, really. She was studying to be a special needs teacher at the time and just had this idea of linking computers with people who were physically disabled to make music.
Baz, could you play music before you came to the Drake Project?
No, it's definitely no.
And how long have you been coming here?
Yes, we say it in years, yes? 1 year? 2 years? 3 years? It's 3 years.
What plans do you have for the future?
First word, yes. White, yellow, first line. I, first word again. White, yellow, green, first line, second line, third line, fourth line. I walk, go, come, work. You want to work? First word, second word, yellow, orange, first orange, first line, second line, pen, pencil, paper, page, book, workbook, letter, parcel, symbol, word, news, story, picture, radio, music. You want to work with music. He wants to work with music.
We use computers to suit the individual's needs. So some people may only be able to use their chin, so they'll use a switch for that. And the whole aim of the project is that the disabled person comes to us and we're here to explore the possibilities of their musical ability.
This is a programme called Escape, which has been written by somebody who works for the Drake Music Project, who's our researcher. It is designed so that anybody who wants to compose music can actually work independently to work on their own music. Leon's using a single switch here to operate the programme, which, when he clicks on the switch, a menu comes up with a number of options with which he can choose what operation he wants to do. So the whole idea is that you can build up a composition or a piece of music by gradually adding one note after another note and then making it shorter or longer, or making it higher or lower. And everything is operated by a single switch.
We've got 2 musicians in London who have been with us for about 8-9 years altogether, basically since the inception of the project. And they now work independently and they tutor for us. They've gone on because there's only so much we can do for them in workshops. So they tutor, they compose, and very often I'll get a phone call, somebody will say, oh well, we need a disabled musician to do a performance, or we'd like somebody to write music for a dance piece or something, and then I will refer Mark or Steve. There is the argument that this is technology, it can't produce the same kind of colours as a violin or a piano. I personally think that's nonsense. Technology is developing all of the time, and with it the possibilities for access are just endless, really.
Alert us at BBC I for your free weekly email listing all BBC TV and radio programmes on your chosen subject at bbc.co.uk/alert.
Working around the world, I've learned to make the connections. The civil war in Congo one year is the next year's refugee problem. That's the way the world really works. The difference is analysis.